My time may begin now. We affirm the resolution resolved. The United States federal taxing and spending policy should be managed by an agency modeled after the Federal Reserve. Let's move into some frameworks so we better understand all the aspects of this topic. In terms of definitions, let's start with federal taxing. This is just taxing done on the national level. Second, in terms of spending policy, this is just governmental spending. When you see the national treasury, you use any big body of the government spending. C, in terms of the third thing that we're going to be defining, that is the Federal Reserve. And this is the committee intended to manage US monetary policy independently of political interference. Let's move into the second piece of framework, which is going to be that of the weighing mechanism. This is a policy round indicated by the word should in the resolution, meaning that you should evaluate this debate on utilitarianism or net benefits, the most amount of good for the most amount of people. Third and finally is going to be on the framework is going to be that of our plan text. Our plan text is that the United States federal government will create the Federal Spending and Taxing Agency, that's the name of it, that will be modeled after the Federal Reserve's capacity over monetary policy. And you should please send that in the chat so everybody can see. Under this, the time frame of this is as soon as possible. The actor is the United States federal government, and the funding is normal ways and means. Are there any questions about the plan? Okay. With that, let's move forward into the background information so we better understand the current system. There are two things that we need to know. First, the Federal Reserve is an organization also known as the central bank and is an organization that is responsible for the creation of monetary policy that is separate from the entity of Congress. This reserve is allowed to pass policy regarding monetary actions like changing interest rates, buying and selling governmental bonds to individual banks. Essentially, there are two things that we need to draw a distinction from. There's monetary policy and there's fiscal policy. Monetary policy is controlling things like interest rates, which controls how much people can borrow. And there's fiscal policy, which is practically how much the government spends and the capacity at which everybody should be taxed. Second is going to be that of fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is controlled like any other bills or any policy action in the United States. Fiscal policy is done by the government. Policies are drafted in the Senate or the House, passed through both committees, and then signed on by the president before being put into effect. With that, our sole advantage is fixing the system. Let's move to our first uniqueness argument, which is that of time delay. Under this, subpoint A is that there are two types of lag that are crucial to explaining why the current system of the government makes the implementation and success of fiscal policy in the current system incredibly low. Let's move into this. The first argument under this is that recognition lag makes it such that it takes even months or years before politicians acknowledge that there's been an economic shock or structural change in the economy. This is simply because of the fact that politicians are not economists and their main priority is not stabilizing the economy, but rather focusing on winning the next election. Second, implementation lag. Even after politicians realize that there is an economic issue which requires a government intervention to solve, policies must pass through both the House and the Senate before being signed by the president. All of this takes weeks to months before they get carried out and put into effect. And at the same time, economic policy is rolled out. The macroeconomic conditions that are consulted to the creation of previous bills may be completely different. So practically what we're saying here is that if we try to pass a bill at some point of time in the year, but then later in the year, the economic conditions are completely different, that bill is going to have a much different effect than it was supposed to when it was drafted. There's also the issue of filibustering and the political gridlock in the House and the Senate, which caused a series of delayed policy action. There are two arguments under this that are incredibly important to realize. It's going to be about COVID-19. The first example of implementation lag comes with COVID-19 and the first stimulus package that got passed. It took weeks for it to be implemented as a direct result of the government having to go through both the House of Representatives and the Senate, with members of the Senate often filibustering. Second is the second COVID stimulus package. This was heavily publicized. It was all over the news. Republicans stated that they didn't want the debt ceiling in the United States to spend too much, and Democrats stated that something had to be done, and there was just a standstill in Congress while millions of people are being unemployed. That moves us into our third argument under these, which is practically the analysis of these points. Both of these examples prove that the current system of Congress and going through each person is actually more harmful than it is beneficial, as millions of people were falling into poverty during COVID-19. To be specific, the range of estimated people that were laid off is between 30 and 40 million. The system of Congress would rather play politics and stand firmly on what their party apparently believes rather than the lives of people. Initially, because these people were not willing to compromise, it takes weeks upon weeks in which people are sliding into unemployment and poverty. The second reason why this is going to take longer, the second time delay argument, is going to be that of pork barreling. This is practically when Congress is set, this is the way that Congress is set up. Policymakers go around with support for their bill and they try to garner that support. The problem is that these bills have the capacity to go into effect with no real problems, typically right when they're drafted. But the problem is because of the system of Congress, pork barreling forces every single person to go around and do something in exchange for one another, saying that, oh, okay, I will support your bill if you add this one change to support my demographic. And that continues onward, meaning that these policies don't get passed at the right time. The second argument here is going to be that modeling the Federal Reserve is good. We tell you that they can control reserve ratios and interest rates very fast. And the Federal Reserve does not have to wait on any governmental body to make a decision like buying bonds on the open market. The links here is that first, the plan passes and the organization like the Federal Reserve is created and responsible for the management of government spending and federal taxing. This creates a material change in a couple of ways. First, it reduces time delay. The agency will, for one, will be just like the central bank and be able to pass policies almost instantly to combat any undesirable macroeconomic conditions. Second, this agency won't be heavily influenced by politicians, rather be built on the strong coalition of economic experts who understand the indicators of a poor economy, which means recognition lag will get solved for in the long term as well. Second, for future emergencies like COVID-19, millions of people without jobs are not going to have to wait on the bureaucratic system because they'll actually get the policies passed faster. They'll be able to get their stimulus checks faster. They'll be able to contribute to the economy faster. They'll be able to pay their rent off faster. They'll be able to pay off their loans faster. All of these things get better in a world where we create this new agency. So this is pretty intuitive. Our impacts are that there's first, a faster response time for emergencies. Second, there are going to be less people in poverty and unemployment because at least we're going to be able to see the economy go up when we have these stimulus packages passed, and also we'll be able to control the economy when it gets out of control. But also altogether, you will see that when people are in poverty or they are in unemployment, they will at least have the benefits of having the economy be doing things like passing stimulus packages to care for them. Ultimately, you're going to see a better economy when you vote for the affirmative. And for all these reasons, we are very proud to affirm. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, I will be getting into my two advantages, or disadvantages, but before that, I want to clarify something about the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve's board is composed of 7 people, and the chair of the Federal Reserve is not allowed to be removed until the president's term is over. Now, both of these things are incredibly important when thinking about how impractical this plan will be when trying to control all taxing and spending for the entirety of America. Now, let's get into our two disadvantages. Our first disadvantage is that this board will not be as effective. There's a few things we can see in the status quo. The first thing we can see in the status quo is that all federal taxing and spending is basically drafted and passed by Congress. The second thing we can see in the status quo is that Congress is structured to meet specific and different economic needs. This is because there's representatives for different districts, some small, some large, and these representatives know the specific economic needs of their constituents. The third thing we can see in the status quo is that congressional spending bills all contain provisions directing specific money to projects in their state. This is called congressionally directed spending, and it brings hundreds of millions of dollars to district and state requests to do things like stimulate employment or repair roads. For example, if there's a hospital that a representative in Arkansas knows is in despair, they can direct federal spending to that hospital if the state government does not have the funds to do that. The fourth thing we can see in the status quo is that the Federal Reserve structure does not allow the people on this board to know the specific needs of their districts. This is because the Federal Reserve splits the country into 12 regions, but each of these regions are absolutely massive. For example, there's one reason for the entire West Coast of Nevada, Idaho, Arizona, Utah, and Alaska. It's structured this way because the Federal Reserve is not supposed to do any specifically directed spending. They're only supposed to know these macro national needs about inflation or deflation or stagflation and set national interest rates. The purpose is entirely different, and we cannot apply it to taxing and spending. So what happens when this plan passes? The first thing that happens is that you are passing all the funding and taxing through this like Federal Reserve structure it will be disastrously inefficient. These regional branches can't be trusted to figure out the exact fiscal needs of every congressional district in the region because they're simply too large and there are simply too few people on this board. The second thing that happens is that urgently needed local projects do not get the funding that they need. The hospital that all the constituents in a city know is crumbling won't get funded because if you're trying to cover 5 different states, you don't care about the needs of one city. And state and local governments won't be able to fill the gap because state and local governments have fundamentally different budget constraints, and the federal government is the only thing that can give like funding to poor country or poor states, for example. So the third thing that happens is that people simply do not get their needs met. The impact of this is a low quality of life for constituents in congressional districts. The second disadvantage is a lack of accountability. There's a few things we can see in the status quo. The first thing we can see in the status quo is that right now in Congress, people are accountable to their constituents' wants. Senators have 6 years and House representatives have 2 years to please their constituents or else they will be voted out. Therefore, they have a large incentive to push for the needs of their community. The second thing we can see in the status quo is that the federal chair is not accountable at all. They're appointed by the president, and after that, they cannot be ousted for the next 4 years. The third thing we can see in the status quo is that Congress is working to meet people's needs. Currently, there's a lot of small spending bills like Richard Shelby in Alabama pushing for funding for a port that will create a lot of jobs in his town. Congress is currently working to meet people's needs, and a lot of these small spending bills that meet constituents' needs are being passed. They're just not massive national bills, so you don't see them in the news all the time. So what happens when this plan passes? The first thing that happens is that the federal appointees by the president don't need to be accountable to absolutely anybody after they're confirmed. The second thing that happens is that this increases the possibility of corruption. If you have, for example, a string of authoritarian presidents like Trump who appoints people to this board can decide to completely neglect anybody's needs in rich corporations, and there's nothing anybody can do about this for 4 entire years. So the impact of this is a disruption of our political system and, again, a poor quality of life because nobody's getting their needs met. Moving on to the government case. So first of all, I just want to illustrate a few reasons why the Federal Reserve is very different from tax policy for like 2 main reasons. The first is that many people don't understand a lot of what the Federal Reserve does, like buying and selling bonds and like all of this international monetary reserves and stuff like that. But people do understand the needs that they have within their communities. The second reason that it's super different is that the Federal Reserve needs to do things that are fundamentally unpopular, like raising interest rates. However, even things that you might think are unpopular, like raising taxes, like constituents will do this if they really need some certain project to be spended on within their region. Look at when California voters raised taxes on themselves to fund schools. Now let's move on to their main contention. So first of all, they talk about how there's this big time delay for 2 reasons. First they talk about how there's a lag and the politicians don't understand their needs. We just think that this is pretty ridiculous because politicians do know about the local economies. They have so many aides, and a lot of these people who are their aides are economists. That's whole job is to study the local economy. These people have the information necessary. And if they don't, the constituents tell them, we tell you that this is just not really that big of an issue. The next issue is that of gridlock. And in response to this, we would say that a lot of things don't take a long time, like approving funding for certain programs that are kind of already known to be pretty stable. There's a certain amount of funding that goes to them. It doesn't take that long to approve that. And a lot of the COVID example, we would say people's needs eventually were addressed. And while it might have taken a little bit longer than we might have wanted, there were also concerns about inflation that other senators were raising as well. And we would say that this is necessary to be addressed. Compromise is necessary. Now, let's move on to what they think will happen. So they think that like everything will be perfect and everything will pass super fast if this plan passes. So the first thing that's wrong with this is that this assumes that everybody within the agency gets along and agrees, which is pretty unlikely that Congress, who has to approve these appointees, will like approve everybody who just thinks the same. Like we're not going to create a monolith here. The second thing that's wrong with this is that it eliminates compromise. If no compromise happens on these bills, that is really bad too. Like we don't want super radical fiscal policy changes to be like happening all the time. And we would say that the negotiations that happen in Congress are actually a good thing because they allow for compromise. And the third response is that like for this COVID example, like what if Republican aligned chairs controlled the agency? Like would they really like pass this COVID relief any faster? Like you can't say that. They're kind of assuming that people who are on this board are always going to align with their views. Whereas we tell you that it's really important to have some sort of compromise and some sort of checks and balances because we don't know who's going to be running this like Federal Reserve modeled taxing and spending agency. So for all of those reasons, I urge a vote for the opposition. Thank you.
Okay, so the order is going to be, I'm going to start on our case, then I'll go to the opponent's case. And if I have time, I'll do some impact weighing at the end. All right, is that good for everyone? Okay, so if everyone's ready, my time begins now. Let's start on our first advantage. Go to like our first uniqueness point about time delay. They make a couple of responses. The first one that they say is like the Federal Reserve needs to do like unpopular things and like they have to increase like interest rates. There's a couple of like responses to this, right? First of all, our opponents make like a really big mistake when they keep talking about like state policies, state pending. If you look at the resolution, it says federal taxes. Like they bring up this example of how California like voters lobbied to raise taxes on themselves. Those were state taxes. Those are controlled by the state government. A lot of the bills that they're talking about, all these local bills, those are controlled by the city government, city politicians. This is talking about federal policy on a much broader scale. When we're talking about federal taxes, we're talking about just that general federal taxes, not the state taxes for every individual state. They talk about how like the reserve needs to do unpopular things. That's not necessarily true. The reserve is there because it was like established by the presidents mainly to have a decentralized system that would allow for instantaneous monetary policy. Now let's get to their point where they talk about how like the reserve is also really slow and like how there's going to be like conflicting points of interest. Our opponents get like really confused on this point, right? In the past, you've seen that the Federal Reserve is structured similar to like Congress in terms of has bipartisan like people, right? It's not like it's just owning like a monolith, right? But the key thing that they misunderstand is the Federal Reserve is not a bunch of politicians. Rather, it's a mix of economists and people like and the board of governors, right? Because they're economists who actually understand like A, how the economy works, and B, are able to like see indicators that like there's going macroeconomic changes or bad conditions. Can I take this after like this uniqueness point? Yeah, they are able to actually understand when to make monetary change. Like if all of these things that they were saying were true, like about how the Federal Reserve can have corruption or there's only one chair, you would see that in the status quo. Trump literally had presidency, right? They talk about Trump. You didn't see the Federal Reserve do anything crazy. The Federal Reserve always makes informed action. Like they have not given you a single example where the Federal Reserve has messed up. You know when policy action has been messed up? Fiscal policy, bad fiscal policy has been passed, but they never give you an example where any instance of the Federal Reserve or there being bad monetary policy, which probably means that all their arguments about corruption or all their arguments about how it's going to be a bad organization probably aren't true. If they can't give you a single example, you probably shouldn't buy this argument about the Federal Reserve being corrupt. Okay, then they say they give like these things about like constituents and like districts and how they have like so many aides. First of all, right, they themselves like explain how the Federal Reserve like has split into like 12 different districts, but they don't understand that the Federal Reserve also has multiple councils, right? It's not like the Federal Reserve is just this one organization. There is literally a council on the Federal Reserve that is meant for community spending and has a bunch of governors from different states in order to have local state spending projects. So all of these arguments probably don't make like a lot of sense at the point where the Federal Reserve is structured to have like multiple committees on it. Yeah, I can take your POI now.
If the Federal Reserve does spending in the status quo, like where are you getting these committees?
What do you mean? Sorry?
The Federal Reserve doesn't control spending. They control.
No. I'm not talking about spending. I'm saying there are like local committees that look at like each different area. That's what I'm saying. Like for buying and selling bonds, right? Like local banks, there are banks in different regions. That's what I'm talking about. I'm not saying like spending, but I'm saying like in our organization, it would be structured so there would also be like local committees that are assigned, but to manage spending, like that's similar to the Federal Reserve. Yeah. Okay, let's go to like our examples about like COVID-19. They talk about how it was like a good thing because certain Republican like senators were controlled with were concerned about inflation. Again, like first of all, the policy, like the people that are part of the Federal Reserve or an organization like the Federal Reserve, which would be like our organization, taxation, would probably be more informed to make like different policy action, and B, they wouldn't spend like a lot of time debating. Like everybody knew that like, the COVID stimulus package was something necessary, right? But there's always going to be this unnecessary timeline, right? We talk about pork barrel policy, which they don't respond to. They try to make the argument that pork barrel policy is like good, but at the end of the day, pork barrel policy just leads to more time delay. It also leads to a waste in federal spending. If we're trying to get a bill out like for the COVID-19 pandemic, right? We want to focus on a broader federal like scale for like emergencies and different things. We don't want there to be like when we're trying to pass a bill to like have like a stimulus bill for COVID-19 for like every other senator to just add different spending bills. That can happen later, which is why it's important to have like a decentralized system that's not with the federal government or with Congress and the Senate so we can pass these policies efficiently.
Really quickly, they said that a lot of things take a lot of time for things that we already know. If an emergency hits like we didn't know, like COVID-19, that hurts.
Yeah, and then they say it like takes a lot of time like to know. But like, here's the thing, right? We explained to you clearly that the Federal Reserve in the status quo, right? This is how you can use this as a benchmark to judge on how good our organization would be. They are able to very quickly understand like the indicators, like just like that. Like if the Federal Reserve like today notices that like interest rates need to go up, it goes up, right? Like, and we don't see any bad policy action happening in the status quo. Again, where is their example where the Federal Reserve is messed up? So that's probably like that argument's really skeptical. Let's just go to like our link arguments, right? We specifically say that we're going to reduce like time delay. Then they say that this assumes that everyone in the agency will work together. We already answered this. I explained to you that in the current reserve system, it's not like everybody's on the same page, but it still takes a lot less time than Congress and Senate. Then they talk about how it eliminates compromise and we don't want fiscal change quickly. The entirety of Congress, over 500 people, like versus 7, like it's just like basically, like the dynamic is like this, right? In Congress, there's a lot more people from every single region. There's just a lot more people in general, right? We're not saying that this is going to be a monolith where everyone agrees, but rather at least everyone's going to be well informed and there's going to be less debate about policy. There's still compromise. I'm pretty sure the Federal Reserve doesn't just I can take this at the bottom. Yeah. I'm pretty sure the Federal Reserve doesn't like just make rash decisions. There's obviously going to be some debate, but it's still fast. Okay. Then they make this argument about like Republican reliant chairs, but like, they make like this argument with Republican reliant chairs, but again, like they don't give an argument of where like the Federal Reserve obviously has had different chairs over time, but like we haven't seen like because there was one chair that like the Federal Reserve was really bad. Like again, there's no examples on this. So we probably get access to all of our impacts. First, faster response times. We're also able to like make sure that there's less people in poverty because if these policies can be passed faster, that means that federal spending actually has like a more direct effect. And 3, we can also like better manage the economy. Okay, let's go to the neg case. Start on their disadvantage one about how the board will not be effective. The first response that we're going to read at the top is that people in Congress are not economics. They have not spent their lives knowing and learning about like economic indicators. This is the people who would be on our committee are people whose entire like livelihoods and jobs is based on the fact of them understanding how the economy works. But let's get to the specifics first. Let's go to this taxing point, right? They first talk about a lot, like they use this example in our case about how the state taxes and like it's going to be like a big mess. 2 things, right? First, this committee is managing broader federal spending and federal taxes. It's not managing like city spending. Most of the policies they're talking about, that's like, for example, for like our city, the San Jose like board of directors, or whoever the committees are, the city committees, they're the ones managing the spending. It's not the federal government. But then next they talk about like meeting different economic conditions. Again, this is not like this is federal spending, not state spending. So all their impacts about like a low quality of life, about there being constituents and like multiple people, this isn't getting effective because this is broader federal spending. But then let's go to their disadvantage too about Congress like is accountable. First thing, they just like make this blanket statement that like big agencies that are controlled by like one person or by a chair are not accountable. Like you can look to ICE. like we hold government agencies accountable. It's not like ICE can just do whatever they want. Like there is still criticism that is put towards all these big organizations. And again, like the Federal Reserve, even though it is controlled by one chair, it still switches out every 4 years, which is like kind of similar to Congress, right? It's like a new one is appointed every single 4 years. So like it makes sense. It's not like it's any different in Congress. Like if you elect a bad congressman, they're still there for like 2 to 4 years. Yeah. So for all those reasons, I strongly urge an half ballot.
Okay. So, I am Kai Taigen. I am the second speaker for the opposition. Okay. All right. So I will start my time now. So beginning on the opposition case on our first contention of efficacy, the first thing they say is that people in Congress are not economists. They're never economists. All the people who are going to be on this Fed committee are going to be experts. So for a start, there are actually like plenty of people in Congress who are economists. For example, Elizabeth Warren was literally an economics professor before she entered the Senate. Also, as we said, and as they don't respond to, Congress people have like staff who are actually trained economists. So there's not some scenario where the only economists who work in the federal government are like in the Fed. Just gut check this, right? The second thing that you need to consider, and this applies to a lot of the case in general, is that like side government just fundamentally assumes that everyone who's appointed to the Fed has to be qualified, and this isn't true. What I wanted to ask from the POI, and what they wouldn't answer, is does the president ever appoint people who aren't qualified? And the answer is yes. When the president is Donald Trump, he can appoint people who are crazy. He can appoint people who don't actually know what they're doing, or he can appoint former like corporate CEOs who are going to just make sure that it's just tax breaks for massive corporations. So there's no guarantee that these people are actually going to be so trained. And what side government fails to understand or fails to tell you is that these people are appointed. They don't just magically like rise out of the ground. Oh, I am a trained and neutral economist. All these people are appointed by politicians, by the president, then confirmed by the Senate. They do not have to be qualified. The only real difference between the Fed, well, there are a couple real differences. The real differences between the Fed and Congress is that once someone is in the Fed, you cannot get them out. This is unique to the Fed. They try to compare it to other federal agencies like ICE, but like because the Fed is supposed to be politically independent, there is a rule where you cannot get rid of the Fed chair. Once they're there until their term ends, and you can't get rid of them even if they're acting like a lunatic, which is not how it works for an agency like ICE. And even in Congress, if someone does something crazy, like they could at least be brought to criminal trial. They could at least be like voted out of office, or you could host a recall vote. Like Jeff Fortenberry was a guy who violated campaign finance law and just got convicted in criminal court and left Congress because Congress holds people accountable in a way that the Fed just doesn't. Then they say that what they're talking about is broad federal policy. All the examples that we give are local policy, state policy. So for a start, this misunderstands what federally directed spending is. Notice the word federal, right? Our example of Richard Shelby is the senator of Alabama. Richard Shelby directed federal money specifically to a port in Alabama, which brought millions of dollars to that port, hundreds of millions of dollars to that port, and created a lot of jobs in his state, jobs that state needed. Specifically in poor states, such as Alabama, such as Louisiana, states with low tax rates and Republican governors who aren't going to pass any spending policy. This is often the only real way to get spending to projects that actually really, really matter. And what you need to understand is what side government is essentially conceding is that the Federal Reserve is only built to handle broad, massive macroeconomic policy. And that works for monetary policy because there's a national thing with inflation. Inflation is national. It's the same across the country. With spending and taxes, it's different, at least with spending, like ignore taxes, but with federal spending, it is different everywhere. Like you spend money in different areas. That's how federally directed spending works in examples like the Richard Shelby thing. So I want to again emphasize that like the Fed is split into 12 regions, and these regions are massive. There's a region that is California, Oregon, Nevada, Washington, Alaska, like Arizona, Utah. That's huge. There is no way that the one Fed governor of that entire region can be trusted to handle the specific economic needs of every single district. They say, oh, Congress is bad because it's big. There's a reason Congress is big. Every district has its representative, and that representative their job is to understand the economic needs of their district. And the Fed can't do that. The Fed just can't. The Fed isn't supposed to do that. That's not what it's built for. So, Again, they just completely drop all the points that we make about like how this is unique, and state and local governments, especially in poor states, can't do this. So all of this is going to extend through when you buy the Federal Reserve is not built to handle local projects, and don't buy their point of like, oh, there are like specific local councils. They couldn't give examples, and they were saying that like it was directing spending, which means that I don't just gut check this fact. This doesn't really make sense. The only thing the Federal Reserve controls is inflation, and so specific local councils would be like, oh, let's control the inflation in this local area. That's not how it works. The Fed only handles one problem, and that is inflation and interest rates, which are national, not local. So moving down to the second contention about lack of accountability, they say there is accountability. Look at ICE. First off, ICE is a bad example because ICE is actually famously not accountable and commits human rights abuses all the time. But again, also the Federal Reserve is uniquely unaccountable. And again, we need to understand about this accountability point. They keep talking about like, oh, like COVID policy and like how people needed that money. All the Republicans in Congress were not a fan of that COVID spending bill. They tried to block it. So if you have a Republican-aligned chair of the Federal Reserve, what you're going to see is that like that's not going to happen. They say these people are trained economists, but you can be a trained economist and still have political views. You can be a trained economist and think, I think the best way to manage the economy is low taxes and no spending. And if you have that person, that stimulus money for national disasters like COVID is not going to flow. And that takes apart most of their case. So on the government case, they say that state like spending is different, that all local spending is directed by state and local governments. Again, this just ignores all the, like the example we gave of Richard Shelby and all federally directed spending. Then they say the Federal Reserve is structured similar to Congress because it has bipartisanship. So this is actually a concession on their point that economists do in fact have political views. Like in their mind, it's like, oh, economists are just these magical, like neutral, objective computers that only make correct mathematical decisions. But that's not how the economy works. The economy is more complicated than that. Everyone has a view. And if you're appointed by a Republican president, you are more likely to favor low taxes and low spending, which is not actually what helps people, right? Like, and that's not what passes COVID stimulus bills. The reason Congress is structured as it is because there's supposed to be disagreement. There's supposed to be people saying, oh, I think we should have more. No, I think we should have less. And then you come to a compromise and you get spending, right? Like maybe there's some magical world where like perhaps the Fed will have a really progressive chair who's going to like is going to favor a lot of spending, in which case it's just incredibly inefficient because of the regional system. But that's assuming you have the best possible person as the Fed chair. And if you have a bad person as the Fed chair, there's no way to get rid of that person, no way to hold that person accountable, and that person can crash the entire economy. They say we have no examples of the Fed like being poor and doing a bad job, but the Fed is famously like in recessionary times had like interest rates too high. That's what caused the recession. In times of extreme inflation, had interest rates too low. For example, the massive inflation we have right now is partially as a result of Jerome Powell's Federal Reserve having extremely low interest rates, which was actually a bad idea. That is an example of the Fed failing to do its job. And the fact they are only willing to raise interest rates now, after all of the massive inflation this country is suffering, shows the Fed is not an infallible organization by any means. They say everyone knew COVID stimulus was necessary. Again, Republicans didn't know this. If you have a Republican chair, that person isn't going to think stimulus and spending is necessary. That person is going to think that that's going to hurt the economy. They won't do spending. And poor people in states like Louisiana are not going to get money for the hospital that it might be in disrepair, for the water system that might need to be cleaned, for the project that could create tens of thousands of jobs in their communities. And that is an issue. That's why this doesn't work. And there's less debate about policy, but there's still compromise in the Federal Reserve. First off, this isn't really warranted, right? Second, like, gut check this. If the Federal Reserve chair is an extreme far-right Republican, like, the reason, like, they can't have both things of the Federal Reserve is so efficient because they don't have to argue, and also the Federal Reserve is so bipartisan because they are arguing, right? The reason why Congress takes a while is because people are actually having a discussion and saying their opinions, and it's not just headed by one person. The Federal Reserve is not like that. The Federal Reserve may be somewhat efficient, but the reason why is because it is centralized control. And specifically for local spending, for all spending, just federal spending across the country, which you have to buy, is often local because of federally directed spending. That system doesn't work. That system is inefficient, and the system is dangerous. If you get the wrong Fed chair, it'll be bad, and even if you have the right chair, it just won't be able to get to all the specific needs that people have. For all these reasons, we urge a strong opposition ballot. Thank you for your time.
Okay. I have two voting issues in my rebuttal today. The first is about meeting people's needs, and the second, if I have time, is going to be about political corruption. So we tell you that the people in our Congress in the United States now are uniquely enabled and encouraged to meet people's needs. This is not only because they're accountable, so they have an incentive to do so, but they are also able to actually meet these needs because they have to focus on one region or one state rather than like 5 states at a time, which is where these like Federal Reserve people focus their energy on. It is essential to have people that are elected by the people in order for their needs to be met. And we see that the system right now is working. We see that people like Richard Shelby, are getting funding for ports in Alabama. And this is really important, especially with poor states that don't have state governments that have enough money to provide this funding. Federal directed spending is something that exists, that is necessary, and that is only effective when you have elected officials in office lobbying for these things to happen. Now, our opponents bring up 2 responses to this. The first is that people's needs will be met better because things will be faster. However, there's a few things wrong with this. The first thing is that it assumes that everybody in this committee agrees. Like, Congress will probably require some sort of variety in opinion if it is a bipartisan Congress. Or it could be a supermajority Congress and then everybody does agree. And then that leads to political corruption and things being passed hastily. And that's not good either. The second thing wrong with this is that this is not a good thing. Compromise is important. Not everybody thinks that COVID spending was a good idea. Famous economists like David Brooks wrote a bunch of articles about why COVID spending was a terrible idea.
And that's arguments about how COVID-19 should not have been stopped, and specifically mentioning David Brooks, is definitely a new argument coming out of the LOR.
Okay, so what I'm doing right now is I'm providing a new example to my partner's broad picture argument that these issues are political and that there's a lot of variety in opinion on them. It's the same exact argument with a little more specificity. Do the judges want to?
Judge's discretion.
Okay, cool. So we need to take these different political opinions and we need to consider both of them in order to make sure that hasty fiscal policy is not passed that doesn't necessarily do what's best for the people. And the last response here is that it's not faster for these regions that will get completely neglected, and nobody will even be thinking about raising policy for these regions. People will simply be neglecting the rundown hospital in rural Arkansas. So it's not faster for those people because their needs aren't going to be addressed or even thought about in the first place. The second response they have here is that people will be experts, so their needs are better met. There's a few things wrong with this as well. The president doesn't always appoint experts. Congress people are experts usually. And even if these people want to do their best, we would tell you that they simply don't have the capabilities to do so because they have such big regions to cover. So when you're evaluating this and meeting people's needs, you need to know that the purpose of the government, especially when it comes to taxing and spending, is meant to meet people's needs and wants. It is meant to do things like create jobs from building a port in Alabama or fix the rundown hospital in rural Arkansas. And politicians are what enables this to happen. Politicians do what they should do because they are accountable to their constituents, they are qualified, and they're able to focus on an individual region. You as judges need to prioritize people actually having their voices heard over passing things maybe faster that, for one, that might not even happen. And if it does happen, you don't even know if you actually want these things to pass faster. You should vote for the opposition, to vote for a world in which there is compromise, to vote for a world in which there's actual attention on the issues of constituents, on the issues of people in these small cities that don't have local and state governments rich enough to pay for all of their problems to be solved. So for all of those reasons, I urge an opposition ballot. Thank you.
All right. So the order of the speech is going to be a gigantic weighing overview at the top. And then it's going to be the aff and then the neg. Okay. Okay, cool. Yeah, sorry. It'll be neg first, actually, then. So it'll be the overview, neg, aff. Everybody good? Cool. Time can start now. There is a huge concession coming out of the block that should end this round. They concede in their last speeches that there will be a faster response as a direct result. They try to backline and say that, oh, this is going to lead to a bunch of hasty responses. Now let's do the weighing on this argument, given that there is concession after we extend it. Let's understand our argument. Right now, we say that if we model a new agency off of the Federal Reserve, what's going to end up happening is that we're creating a new branch of the government that is going to be focusing on the economic indicators of what is going on in the economy and then making responses accordingly to that. And these are specifically economists that have spent their entire life looking at the market and actually understanding what the issues with it are and then making those decisions. Let's do the weighing on this argument. And essentially what this entire debate boils down to. They tell you it's the probability of having a bad person in power. So let's do a couple of and passing bad policy. First, on weighing, we're going to go to probability. 2 warrants under this. First is historical precedent. Not one time in their speech have they given you an example of anybody being appointed that is in a bad position. They tell you that Donald Trump is the most irrational actor in the world, and even he did not appoint a CEO that completely prioritized corporations like they said he would, meaning that the probability of this argument should be very, very low. Your threshold for evaluating it should be very, very high. Second, in terms of passing bad policy, we tell you that there's deliberation. These people are not obviously just going to have one person that goes out and makes the entirety of the decision. There are a bunch of different districts. People analyze those districts, come together on a decision, and then as a direct result, pass a blanket and gigantic approach to actually quash any issues in the economy. That answers the weighing on their case. So altogether, you can see that we're probably ahead on the time delay argument, meaning that our policies are going to get passed faster with the same, if not better, efficacy. The only difference, given that our opponents have conceded this argument, is that millions of people go into poverty faster in their world as a direct result of us not passing our plan. In the current world, we already give you the 2 warrants of COVID. We tell you that the first stimulus package did not get passed in time, and the second one didn't get to either as a direct result of what was happening right now. Let's go to their case. Let's talk about their case and the problems with local project and state spending. First, a majority of the spending is dealt with within the state and is generated via taxes. Via state taxes. The majority of the funding for these local projects is dealt with the city politicians and city governments and politicians who are these constituents that they're talking about. Second, they talk about the fact that the Federal Reserve is not equipped to work on local projects. But that is untrue because the Federal Reserve literally has the Communications Advisory Council with 15 Community Advisory Council with 15 CAC members who are focused on the specific communities and low income and moderation populations. Judges, you can gut check this argument because our plan passes. If it passes, is the equivalent of the CAC for federal funding that will be created that takes out their entirety of their first disadvantage because we have proven to you that we're still going to be caring for these people on the ground on these local areas. Next, on their argument about political corruption, they say that the Fed will become corrupt. But if we have a president like Donald Trump, that's simply untrue. First, they mishandle our argument about ICE. We didn't say that, you held ICE accountable. We're saying that no matter what ICE does, they're still able to get away with it. You can see them literally abusing humanitarian problems on the border and literally treating people terribly. Next, they concede the argument that for everybody in the Senate is controlled and they get elected every 4 years, every 6 years, meaning that the idea that there's bipartisan things in nature still exists either way. There are people that are going to be put in power for long periods of time that still exists. They make the argument that we can actually kick these people out. The way that the Federal Reserve would work in this case is that if the person was making bad policy action, they wouldn't be the ones controlling everything. That's the whole point because they're still deliberating. With that, all we need to do is go to our case and prove why we're ahead on the weighing levels. We already extended our links, so let's understand what our 2 cases look like. In the affirmative, you have a new world, practically in which we're able to attack federal and monetary policy a lot better because we have the Fed controlling the monetary policy and we have our new agency controlling this federal policy and the spending policy. This is going to actually vanquish every single argument that my opponents make because we're telling you we're going to pull people out of poverty faster. We're going to have faster response times. Remember, they make a huge concession in their speech telling you that for things that we already know, we have allocated budgets and we have fast response times. But remember, for things we don't know, like emergencies, like COVID-19, that literally hit us in the face that we were not knowing about and were unprecedented. These need people to spend fast and spend quick because we saw 30 to 40 million people fall into unemployment as a direct result of COVID-19. All of these arguments are conceded out of the block. I strongly urge you to look at your flow. We tell you that 30 to 40 million people were pushed into poverty because nothing was done fast enough. You know for a fact that 30 to 40 million people got pushed into COVID-19, into unemployment because of COVID-19. That is a reason why you vote for us on magnitude. You know that the probability of somebody being put into power has never that did anything bad has never been happened in the past. And for all these reasons, we are very proud to affirm. Thank you.
Here. Would it be helpful to pause the recording?
Recording stopped.
Great. Also, Mark and Eric, what's the process for giving decision?
If we have time, what I'd suggest is that you tell people the decision. I actually can't find it anymore. Like, I can't see the outcome. And then you can give the decision and then your feedback, and then each of us can give feedback. I assume we have time for that. I don't know if there's anybody from the tournament here.
Sure. I think Joel is. Okay. And for oral feedback, are you asking for sort of our adjudication process or just to the debaters how they could have improved? Okay, sounds great. Well, great. Congratulations for getting to Octofinals. The debate was really interesting. Really love economic policy.
Recording in progress.
The final decision was a 3-0 consensus decision for the opposition. I'll briefly talk about how I resolved the adjudication, and then I'm sure the other judges would be happy to jump in. So essentially, the way that the round breaks down is that the opposition side has a slightly lower risk that there's going to be a situation where the Federal Reserve just goes off the walls and starts completely destroying the economy. They're also more likely to do federally directed spending. We get argumentation from Gov, which is that, the Federal Reserve still has local committees, and so it's very likely to still do local spending. But this is unlikely because MO gives argumentation that is the Federal Reserve might have ideologies that lead them to be less likely to do this form of spending. And also, even though it's the case that on both sides we get counter assertions about whether or not these particular committees do exist, the only side that warrants why they're unlikely to exist is that the existing reason that the Federal Reserve exists is to solve national problems. And so it's unlikely to have these committees in the status quo. So what that means then is even if we buy the best case situation of Gov, oh, by the way, OP is also more likely to have federally directed spending because politicians have active incentives to be re-elected and necessarily then give these dollars to Alabama, for example, as opposed to the board, which has a lower incentive. So what this means together then is I do think it's likely that the Gov plan is marginally faster, but there are 3 weighing reasons why speed isn't really sufficient to vote for Gov. The first is that MO points out that to the extent you're faster, that also probably means you have a little less compromise and a little less debate. So the arguments are at tension with one another to some degree. Secondly, being faster also means you're more likely to have hasty decisions. I'm happy to talk about how I resolved that clash, but I don't want to have a very long adjudication. So ask me if you would like to see how that was resolved. And then thirdly, the federally directed spending argument that OP gives mitigates a lot of the economic harms that Gov is talking about. So even in a world where COVID-19 is problematic and there's financial destitution that exists, since politicians are likely to still try to do the federal hospital spending and that sort of thing, there are alternative ways to mitigate the types of problems Gov has talked about, but there aren't alternative ways to prevent the Federal Reserve from going crazy or doing the other sorts of development. So that was sort of how I saw it around. Eric and Mark, if you'd want to jump in, feel free.
Sure. Thanks so much. I mean, I agree with a lot of that. I think that sort of there's a few paradigms the round is working in, but there are big spending bills and small spending bills, right? So small spending bills, I think OP just wins because there are more Congress people and they are representing local areas and are accountable to local constituents and have local knowledge, right? I think that Gov's point that there is a council in the Fed that for local spending is like a smart observation. But I think then when it kind of comes out that it's 15 people, it almost sort of articulates OP's point, right? That OP there's 7 directors and 15 people on a national council, as opposed to 500 plus Congress people representing every geographical niche of the United States. And I think that's compelling. I think that's the easiest thing. And that OP does a really good job saying yeah, there's big bills and those get a lot of criticism because they're national, but there's all these small bills that are also funding hospitals, funding courts, etc. I think for big bills, I think the problem coming out of Gov is that Gov kind of says like, it's sort of like, believe me, the version of the COVID spending bill we had is what everyone believed we needed, and we needed it right away. And like, I guess I don't know why that's necessarily true, that like, if you pass a bill that's really bad, or you have really fast inaction, like they decide to do nothing quickly, then that seems worse than having like a lot of different opinions. So like, I think the last Gov speech makes a good argument about how like maybe there won't be somebody who's like outrightly sort of like evil or despotic at the top of this board. Although I do think OP like distinguishes this board from the Fed, where that is still a possibility, even if there hasn't been historically in the Fed. But I do think that it's possible that it's like, if there's these 7 voting people, like, right, they're not, I think the term used, which was very apt, was like, they're not economy machines, right? Like they still have like values bias. I don't even know if that's bias. Like they still have values, like they have certain goals they want to achieve, and those might be bad goals, and they're not really checked against anything. I actually think OP could have won this round more easily, because, so I think and this is something I used to do this as a debater, I see it in debaters a lot. The fact that Gov is talking about fiscal policy does not mean you should talk about fiscal policy. It actually means you probably shouldn't, right? So like, Gov is talking about dollars and cents, but what the plan does, so every plan is a spending policy, right? Like COVID policy needs to be funded, but it takes an expertise in public health. Education policy needs to be funded, but it takes an expertise in education, right? So like, when they're talking about spending policy, I think you can say like, what they're actually doing, like if you look at the COVID bill, it took like an incredible amount of expertise in public health and local infrastructure, and you're designating those kinds of decisions to a board of 7 economists, which is like totally nuts, right? So I think like, if they're talking about spending and they're trying to reduce the round to spending, I think that's where they have the best argument, right? That like economists are going to make good spending policy. Fine, like that's compelling. But like, I think you want to say like, yeah, but the round isn't about spending. It's about all these other things that have to be funded, and we're arguably at least designating that to a board of economists.
Yeah, I mean, Eric's last points kind of resonate with me. I mean, basically, I thought the member op speech carried the round. I thought it was the best speech. It was just a set of little bombs, like one after the other. And the main point that he made is that, you know, these appointments are going to be made by partisan politicians, and those appointments might be incompetent, super biased. Like there's no reason to assume that the appointments will be good, competent, or sort of like neutral economic-y. And so that basic point, I think, undermined a lot of the government case. Maybe it was unfair that it came late, but then the prime minister like just ignored it. It's as if he hadn't said it. And I thought that was like a very, very powerful point, that there's no reason to think like, if a Republican appoints, you know, a majority of this new board, and those people don't want to enact a stimulus package, then it's not going to happen. You know, there are ways to counter that. I mean, I think there are actually very subtle institutional oriented arguments why this is a plausible resolution. But I don't think I think Gov just basically, for me, ignored the partisan practical reality. That's funny, Eric. I think Gov basically just ignored those points in the MO, which for me really resonated. I do think, by the way, the op could have said that the burden has to be huge on this resolution because it's a major change. They didn't say that. So I didn't think that way. But at the end of the day, I was kind of like, thought it was kind of even and messy until member op. And then the member of op made so many points about practical politics, which I thought then the prime minister would have had their hands full, but the prime minister largely ignored those points. So that's for me what carried the day.
Here's